Imagine this. You've been planning the trip of a lifetime for months. Your bags are packed, your boarding pass is in hand, and you're ready to jet off to an adventure you've been dreaming about. But just as you're about to step onto the plane, you're told you can't board. No explanation, no apology, just a cold, dismissive no. For most people, this would be a frustrating end to the story. But for one woman, it was just the beginning. This is the story of how she was denied her seat on a flight and how she ended up taking the entire airline instead. It all started on a crisp autumn morning at a bustling international airport. The terminal was alive with the hum of excited travelers, rolling suitcases, and the occasional wail of a tired toddler. Among the crowd was Emma Carter, a sharp, determined woman in her early 30s, with a knack for turning setbacks into opportunities. Emma was no stranger to challenges. She'd built a successful career in tech by outthinking problems and refusing to take no for an answer. But today, she wasn't dealing with a glitchy software program or a stubborn client. Today, she was up against something far more infuriating, an airline that seemed determined to ruin her plans. Emma had booked her ticket weeks in advance, double-checked her reservation, and arrived at the airport with plenty of time to spare. But when she approached the gate, the agent gave her a look that made her stomach drop. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the agent said, not sounding sorry at all. "Your seat has been reassigned. The flight is overbooked, and you'll have to take the next available one." Emma's mind raced. Overbooked, reassigned. She had a meeting halfway across the world in less than 24 hours, and this delay would cost her everything. She tried to reason with the agent, but the response was the same, a shrug and a cold, corporate, "Policy is policy. What happened next would change Emma's life and the airline's future forever." Instead of accepting the situation, Emma did something no one saw coming. She didn't yell, she didn't cry, and she didn't storm off. She simply smiled, nodded, and walked away. But this wasn't a smile of defeat. It was the smile of someone who had just made a decision, a big one. Over the next few weeks, Emma would use every ounce of her wit, resourcefulness, and determination to turn the tables on the airline that had wronged her. What started as a personal vendetta would soon become a battle that captivated the world. But how does someone go from being denied a seat to taking over an entire airline? That's the question we'll explore in this story. Along the way, we'll meet key players. The ambitious CEO of the airline, the overworked employees caught in the middle, and the loyal friends who stood by Emma's side. We'll see how one woman's fight for fairness turned into a movement that challenged the very foundations of corporate power. And we'll uncover the shocking twists and turns that kept everyone guessing until the very end. As we dive into this tale, one thing becomes clear. This isn't just a story about revenge. It's a story about resilience, creativity, and the power of standing up for what's right. It's a reminder that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest acts of defiance. So, buckle up, because this is going to be one wild ride. By the end of this video, you'll be left wondering, what would you do if you were in Emma's shoes? And more importantly, what would the airline do next? Emma Carter wasn't the kind of person who let things slide. She had always been a fighter, someone who believed in fairness and accountability. Growing up in a small town, she'd learned early on that if you wanted something, you had to work for it. Her parents weren't wealthy, but they taught her the value of perseverance and standing up for herself. Those lessons had carried her through college, where she'd worked 2 jobs to pay her tuition, and into her career, where she'd quickly risen through the ranks in the competitive world of tech startups. But this was different. This wasn't about a promotion or a project deadline. This was about respect. And Emma wasn't about to let anyone, especially a faceless corporation, take that away from her. As she stood in the airport that day, watching her plane take off without her, Emma felt a familiar fire ignite inside her. She wasn't just angry. She was determined. She knew the airline had a policy of overbooking flights, a common practice in the industry to maximize profits. But knowing that didn't make it right. She had paid for her seat, just like everyone else on that plane. Why should she be the one to suffer because of their greed? As she waited in line to rebook her ticket, her mind began to race. There had to be a way to hold them accountable, to make sure this didn't happen to anyone else. But how? Over the next few days, Emma couldn't shake the feeling of injustice. She tried to focus on her work, but the incident kept replaying in her mind. She found herself researching airline policies, reading countless stories of passengers who had been treated unfairly, and even joining online forums where people shared their own experiences. The more she learned, the more she realized how widespread the problem was. It wasn't just her, it was thousands of people every year left stranded, frustrated and powerless. And the airlines, they seemed untouchable, hiding behind fine, print and corporate jargon. But Emma wasn't one to back down from a challenge. She started to brainstorm ways to fight back. At first, her ideas were small, writing a strongly worded email, filing a complaint, maybe even starting a social media campaign. But as she dug deeper, she began to think bigger. What if there was a way to hit them where it really hurt? What if she could turn the tables in a way they'd never see coming? It was a risky thought, but Emma had never been afraid of risks. After all, she'd built her career on taking chances and thinking outside the box. Meanwhile, across town, the CEO of the airline, Richard Grayson, was sitting in his corner office, oblivious to the storm that was brewing. Richard was a man who prided himself on efficiency and results. He'd spent years climbing the corporate ladder, and now, at the helm of one of the largest airlines in the country, he was determined to keep it at the top. To him, overbooking was just a numbers game, a necessary evil to keep profits high and shareholders happy. He rarely thought about the passengers who were inconvenienced. In his mind, they were just statistics, collateral damage in the pursuit of success. But Richard's confidence was about to be tested in a way he couldn't have imagined. Unbeknownst to him, Emma was quietly putting a plan into motion. She started by reaching out to a few close friends, people she trusted and who shared her sense of justice. There was Jake, her college roommate and a brilliant software engineer, Mia, a former journalist with a knack for uncovering the truth, and Raj, a lawyer who specialized in corporate law. Together, they formed an unlikely team, united by a common goal: to take on the airline and make them pay for their mistakes. The first step was gathering evidence. Emma and her team spent weeks collecting data, flight records, passenger complaints, internal memos, anything they could get their hands on. It wasn't easy. The airline was notoriously secretive, and they had to be careful not to tip their hand. But slowly, piece by piece, they began to build a case. What they found was shocking. The airline wasn't just overbooking flights. They were systematically manipulating the system to maximize profits at the expense of their customers. It was a pattern of behavior that went all the way to the top. As the evidence piled up, Emma knew they had something big, but she also knew that exposing the truth wouldn't be enough. If they really wanted to make a difference, they needed to hit the airline where it hurt the most, their bottom line. That's when she came up with the idea that would change everything. It was bold, risky, and a little crazy, but it just might work. She called it Operation Skyfall. The plan was simple in theory, but complex in execution. Using Jake's tech skills, they would create a platform that allowed passengers to band together and fight back against unfair practices. The platform would provide tools for filing complaints, sharing stories, and even organizing boycotts. But that was just the beginning. Emma's ultimate goal was to use the platform to buy up enough shares in the airline to gain a seat on the board. It was a long shot, but if they could pull it off, They would have a voice in the company's decisions and the power to hold them accountable. As the team worked tirelessly to bring Operation Skyfall to life, tensions began to rise. They knew they were up against a powerful opponent, and one wrong move could bring the whole thing crashing down. But Emma refused to let fear stop her. She had come too far to turn back now. Every late night, every setback, every moment of doubt only fueled her determination. She was no longer just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly by the airline. And she wasn't going to stop until she won. Meanwhile, Richard Grayson was starting to notice something was off. Reports of increased passenger complaints, a sudden spike in social media activity, and whispers of a new platform dedicated to taking down the airline began to reach his desk. At first, he dismissed it as a minor nuisance, something his PR team could handle. But as the days went by, the pressure began to mount. Shareholders were asking questions, employees were growing uneasy, and the media was starting to take notice. Richard realized too late that this wasn't just a PR problem, it was a full-blown crisis. And then, one morning, it happened. Emma and her team launched Operation Skyfall, and within hours, it went viral. Passengers from all over the world flocked to the platform, sharing their stories and joining the movement. The airline's stock began to plummet as investors grew. Nervous, Richard found himself scrambling to contain the damage, but it was too late. The genie was out of the bottle, and there was no putting it back in. As the story spread, Emma became a symbol of hope for millions of people. She was no longer just a woman who had been denied a seat on a flight. She was a leader, a trailblazer, someone who had dared to stand up to a giant and fight for what was right. But her journey was far from over. The airline wasn't going down without a fight, and Richard Grayson was determined to protect his empire at all costs. The battle lines had been drawn, and the stakes were higher than ever. What happened next would test Emma's resolve like never before. Would she be able to outmaneuver the airline and achieve the impossible? Or would Richard's resources and influence prove too much to overcome? The answers to those questions would come in the next chapter of this incredible story. But one thing was certain: the world was watching, and nothing would ever be the same.